Thank you. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Erich Ferrari, who will be speaking about the impact of sanctions on the Iranian government.
Well, first of all, Tim raised a lot of really important issues that I hope everyone will be thinking about throughout the course of the rest of this event. I'd like to take a minute and thank everyone who put together this event. I'm very honored to be here. It's very nice to come to an event where we can talk about the policy and the humanitarian aspect of what's going on with sanctions and not just delve into legalese and minutia. So I'm very honored to be here. I'm very glad to be talking about this subject. I am going to talk a little bit later about what the impact on the government of Iran has been. But first, I want to address a question, and that question is, what is sanctions? In about a week, I'll be shipping up to Portland to serve as a consultant to the defense team of Dr. Hossein Lahiji and Najmeh Vahid. I was reading the trial memorandum from that case that the government put out, and the government made this comment about they violated Executive Orders 12957 and 12959. This is what is known as the Iranian sanctions. It's wrong. It's not the Iranian sanctions. The Iranian sanctions don't exist as one unified body of regulations. They are a patchwork of different statutes, of different regulations, of different general authorizations, of different executive orders, so on and so forth. Let me demonstrate my point. 10 legislative statutes are involved, 25 executive orders, 28 Federal Register notices, 4 bodies of regulations, 242 specific regulations, and 5 United Nations Security Council resolutions. Okay, so when you talk Iran sanctions, you're not just talking about one law, don't do this. You're talking about this complicated legal regulatory framework and scheme that, quite frankly, takes people like Tim and I years to understand and be able to explain to people how it works in a practical environment. So it's a very difficult question to answer. What are Iran sanctions? There's no one clear answer because it's this huge patchwork. So if it's difficult for folks like Tim and I to answer that question, then how are average Iranians supposed to answer that question? How are average Americans supposed to answer that question? How are average people in Europe supposed to answer that question who may be impacted by the sanctions in one way or the other? Whether it's the inability to get certain types of medicine, whether it's an exporter in Dubai who doesn't know that his transshipping and re-export of laptop computers to Iran is a criminal violation which can land him in jail in the United States. Or when it's a family in the United States who wants to bring their inheritance money from Iran and then has the FBI knocking at their door asking questions about why they received $30,000 transaction from XYZ Corporation in Kuwait. Sanctions target states, they target individuals, they target entities, but they are enforced against people. People feel the repercussions of the sanctions as much as any corporation or any bank does. Let me give you an example, and I brought up this example earlier. I have a client who just pled guilty last Tuesday to violations of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This is one of the statutes through which sanctions are issued and promulgated. His crime, in part, was exporting 21 Panasonic computers from the United States to Dubai and then on to Iran. Tuesday, he pled guilty to this crime. On Thursday, the United States government, through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, issued General License D, providing an authorization for the export of hardware and software related to information technologies. So my client, Omid, when he gets out of jail, he will be able to go back to Dubai and export the same thing that landed him in jail, and he'll be able to do so legally. So 1 minute, he's a national security threat. The next, he's a captain of industry. Why is this? Because these laws are based on contemporary political considerations. And whatever the prevailing wind is in Washington that day could mean the difference between illegality and legality. And individuals like Omid are stuck in the middle. Omid is not a United States citizen. He's not a green card holder. He is a foreign national residing in Dubai, and yet he's being held in jail in Washington, D.C. because he violated U.S. law, a U.S. law that is increasingly becoming more complicated, which is already incredibly complicated. So we ask what sanctions are. We need to understand this framework. We need to understand who it impacts. Now let me turn my attention to the second question. What is the impact on the government of Iran? I believe it was last August, Undersecretary of Terrorism Financial Intelligence David Cohen said to a group at New York University, "We have successfully pushed Iran into the financial backwaters of the internet, or into the backwaters of the international financial system." To a round of applause. And I got to ask the question, is that a good thing? This is a nation which the United States government has publicly alleged is engaged in proliferation activities, support of who we've deemed international terrorist organizations, human rights abuses. I'm not a political expert. I'm not an Iran expert, so I'm not going to debate whether or not the allegations are accurate or whether they're false. That's not the point. The point is this is the basis the U.S. government has provided. So the question I would have for Mr. Cohen is, if you believe this, if you believe that Iran is engaged in all of this nefarious activity, why would you want them in the backwaters and operating in non-transparent ways? Wouldn't it make more sense to have them where you can see them, where you can monitor their activity? So I don't think that's a success from a U.S. policy standpoint that we've pushed them into using all these back channels. I really don't. There was a discussion we had this morning, and actually I had some talking points on this, but I've thrown them out the window because of this discussion we had this morning. Because it's an important question that came up. Are sanctions working? And people debate this all the time in Washington and around the world. Do sanctions work? But what they don't state is, what is the definition of working? What do we consider to be working? Is it a devaluation of the rial? Is it the inability of people in Iran to obtain medicine? Is it the inability of the IRGC to procure material needed for proliferation activities? What is our definition of working? I'm here to offer a definition, if you want to come up with definitions and determine whether or not sanctions are working, okay? If you look at the executive orders that form the basis of the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations, and a lot of the other laws, they highlight three considerations. Why are we imposing sanctions? For three reasons. One, Iran's perceived proliferation activities, support of international terrorists, and human rights violations. So we're saying we're imposing sanctions because we want to compel a change in behavior from Iran. We want them to stop engaging in these three activities. And to do that, we've imposed the Iranian assets controls regulations. Then we went forward with the Iranian transactions regulations, the Iran sanctions, Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, CISADA, the human rights sanctions regulations, on and on and on and on. Has Iran ceased its proliferation activities? Have they ceased their support of international terrorists? Have they ceased their human rights violations? We're increasing pressure with the idea that they're going to stop engaging in these three things. That's what we're trying to seek from them. I can't answer the question because, again, I'm not an Iran expert. I've never been in Iran. I was born here, and although I deal in Iran sanctions issues and I talk to clients who are in Iran or in the Middle East or in tune, I can't say whether or not Iran is doing X, Y, and Z. I don't have any personal information to make that statement. But what we hear from the media, what a lot of people believe, is that they're not. And indeed that the activities have actually gone above and beyond where they were previously, despite the heavy layering of sanctions that we continue to lean upon. So, where does that leave us? Does it mean, all right, sanctions didn't work, military intervention? I sure hope not, and I don't think, honestly, that there's much appetite for that in Washington. There's certainly some appetite for it. Does it mean that we give up on sanctions altogether? Some people wouldn't mind seeing that. I don't necessarily know if that's a good thing. I, unlike Tim, happen to be a proponent of sanctions when they're used in a responsible and efficient manner, which brings me to my third point. We need to revise what the sanctions program is. We need to take into consideration the human aspects of sanctions. We need to make sure that innocent people or people who are inadvertently violating it because they just, quite frankly, don't understand a complicated regulatory framework in a foreign country are not impacted. And we need to be smarter and more efficient. I have, through my practice, not only been involved in compliance and licensing issues with Iran, or in defense of criminal defendants who have been caught up in sanctions violations, but I've also had the opportunity to represent a number of individuals and companies who have been placed on the OFAC SDN list, the embargo list, for engaging in certain types of activity, or at least allegedly engaging in that type of activity. These weren't Iranian parties. These weren't proliferators of weapons of mass destruction. These weren't providing material assistance to terrorist organizations. These were, for example, people who have been designated under the narcotics trafficking kingpin regulations, meaning that they were involved in large-scale narcotics trafficking. And I've seen firsthand, through my interactions with these individuals and trying to remove them from this list, the impact that targeted sanctions against the country, or sorry, not a country, a company or individual can have. And I can tell you that they're much more effective than wide, broad-based, country-based sanctions programs like Iran, like Cuba. I draw this analogy to you're playing on a soccer field, right? And one guy gets mad at the other guy. And he says, you know what? I'm not going to play with you anymore. I'm going to go home. And quite frankly, if you guys want to play with him, I'm taking my ball home. And I'm going to go home. Well, when you're dealing with a country like Iran that has resources, that has money, that has established trading relationships, there are going to be people who continue to deal with Iran. There's going to be China's, there's going to be Russia's, there's going to be Malaysia, India, okay? But when you target individuals and companies, it's much easier to isolate them. So if you want a solution, it needs to be a move to specifically targeting individuals, entities, bad actors, as we call them. And then compelling international pressure on those particular actors. But don't sanction an entire country of 78 million people. Because it hasn't worked, and it's pretty clear that it hasn't worked. So those are my thoughts, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much.